Hi, everybody. Welcome to English Digest. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Tom.
It's our all-English lecture. So that means we've got to talk a little bit more slowly and no Chinese, which is kind of hard because Tom and I both kind of mix words, in both languages in our real lives because we have friends who are Taiwanese or family members who speak Chinese. So today, though, we can't. We must be good. And it's going to be all English. It's kind of fun. It's our art unit. I'm not very artistic, at least with the visual arts. I'm a musician. That's a little different. But here we're going to be discussing Heavenly Light, the art and science of stained glass. I love stained glass.
Stained glass, of course, is most commonly seen in churches. When I think of stained glass, of course, I immediately think of those ancient churches in Europe that I've never been to before, but that's where you see stained glass most of the time. I'm sure nowadays, of course, lots of artists probably use this process to create works of art that don't have anything to do with religious themes, but in any case, we should at least concede or admit that stained glass does come from churches in Europe for the most part, and that is a interesting art. It's kind of complicated, and I think it requires a lot of skill to do.
Actually, for the more simplified stained glass works of art, you can buy them. I was over in England a couple of years ago in Cornwall, which is near the ocean. And one of the tourist shops had stained glass souvenirs you could buy, and I did buy it. And you have to put it near the window, and when the sun shines through it, it looks gorgeous. So a lot of people are looking into this area of art, stained glass, and there's also a house in my parents' neighborhood that have a few stained glass windows, which is so pretty. Of course, they didn't pay a fortune like some of these cathedrals and churches did. Those are very, very complicated and ornate. We'll talk about some of these and some of the history of it. But first, guys, we're going to read through today's lesson.
In many of Europe's historic cathedrals, worshippers have found peace for the past 2,000 years in the serene illumination that shines through multicolored stained glass windows. A garden of light overwhelms a church's interior as though God's presence were being cast by the sun, subtly animating the holy surroundings as the day progresses. Stained glass has been made since ancient times, but it was the spread of Christianity throughout Europe that saw it become a dominant art form. With characters and settings forged into glass, these windows were used to portray religious narratives for teaching purposes. During the Middle Ages, some of these displays came to be known as the poor man's Bible. The printing press had yet to be developed, and stained glass, along with paintings and carvings, gave churches a tool for spreading Christian parables. Radiating their stories throughout soaring churches were illuminated angels, saints, spirits, and other biblical figures. By the 12th century, advances in architectural capability allowed church builders to install enormous windows that filled their interiors with a more radiant kaleidoscope of color. Manufacturing such an array of stained glass art was an extraordinary technical accomplishment. First, colored sheets of glass would be made. This was done by adding metal oxide powder to the glass in its molten state. Unique metals produced individual colors. Cobalt turned glass blue, for example. However, the production process was unpredictable as it required a precise amount of ingredients and used a furnace that was difficult to control. Any small variations would cause imperfections in color. Glass of different colors would then be cut into precise shapes to fit together in the patterns that artisans had previously sketched out. Finally, the pieces would be rigorously welded together with lead and a hot piece of iron. The ways in which art, science, religion, and technical skill were fused to create such aesthetic wonders are remarkable. Although stained glass is still made today, Never does it seem to be produced on such a majestic scale.
Let's take a look at the title. It's kind of cool. Heavenly Light. Light shining through these stained glass windows. Felt like light from heaven was coming into the church where these stained glass windows were kept. We say stained glass. Typically, they were windows, of course. And the whole window, of course, you couldn't open and shut these windows. They were precious. The workmanship that went into these is just extraordinary. I know one tour I went on was just to see stained glass windows in different churches. So let's take a look at that first paragraph. It says, in many of Europe's historic cathedrals, worshippers have found peace for the past 2,000 years in the serene illumination that shines through multicolored stained glass windows. So let's take a look here first. Of course, if you're going to Europe and you're looking at historic cathedrals, you're looking at old Catholic churches that are still, being used today. And, if you go to a cathedral, you're going to a church that belongs to the Catholics. So the Catholic Church is just one Christian church that's out there. The cathedral was the principal church of a bishop. So it was for kind of a district of people, and he would serve them in that district. Now, some of these cathedrals are really big, right? Very tall, very beautiful. And almost all of them that I can think of have at least one stained glass window. And it's just not pretty colors. They would actually cut the glass so that it represented a story in the New Testament. For example, when John the Baptist comes and baptizes Jesus, that would be one of the windows.
That'd be pretty cool. That, of course, reminds me of temples here in Taiwan, where they have illustrations of various moral stories from Taoism and Buddhism.
Right.
So in this particular case, they were talking about the Christian religion, and so you'll see stories from the Bible depicted in stained glass in those cathedrals. And yes, people have found peace for the past 2,000 years in the serene illumination that shines through multicolored stained glass windows. So here we've got the word serene, which means peaceful and untroubled and without any kind of noise.
Yeah, if you see someone who looks very peaceful, that's an adjective that you could use. Oh, he looks so serene, or she looks so serene. In today's crazy world, it's not often that people look serene out there. It seems like everyone's running around and busy. But serene is a wonderful feeling if you get it. It's just calm and peaceful. You don't have any troubles. Very tranquil. So, yeah, a lot of worshipers or people who attend these churches, they go to the cathedrals or churches to feel some peace from God. And this has happened for the past 2,000 years. It's a serene illumination. Now, an illumination could be different things, but usually here it just means some sort of light or lighting, a display of lights, on a building or in a structure. So it's a serene illumination. Looking at those stained glass windows is very peaceful, I must say. It just gives you this nice feeling. On sunny days, that light comes right through the window, and it looks like there's a backlight sort of shining into the window. It looks like it's on stage, if you know what I mean.
And of course, if you're religious and you see that kind of stuff inside the church, you'll think it's a message from God or something like that, because the colors are so bright and they're so real that you can't not but be affected by them. Illumination also is a word that I think of when we're talking about buildings at night, how they're lit up, the illumination of the building, for example. Of course, buildings always have lights on them at night so people can see them. And yes, they're multicolored, lots of different colors here. And let's talk about another description here. A garden of light overwhelms a church's interior as though God's presence were being cast by the sun. subtly animating the holy surroundings as the day progresses. So yeah, we're describing this as a garden of light. A garden usually has plants and stuff like that. Like my grandmother's garden, she grew corn and squash and potatoes and stuff like that. But in this particular case, it's just kind of an area with light there, and it overwhelms the church's interior. Usually you've got pews in there, these long benches, and maybe the altar and stuff like that. It's nice, but it's kind of boring. But if you get these bright colors coming in there, ooh, it overwhelms the interior of the church. It just really brightens it up. And this is though, or it's like God's presence were there. The presence of God perhaps is being cast by the sun there, and that will subtly animate the holy surroundings. So here again, we've got another word, subtly. That's an adverb. The adjective form of this word is subtle, which means it's there, but it's not really noticeable. So yeah, you could maybe get some subtle hints from your girlfriend to ask you or to get you to ask her to marry her or something. She'll give you some subtle hints, but here we're using it as an adverb. It will subtly animate. Animate here just kind of gives life to something, so it's not really noticeable, but if it's too noticeable, then it's not really special.
So it's animating the holy surroundings or bringing that church to life. You feel like suddenly, it's alive inside. We use animating also to talk about giving a movie or a character the appearance of movement. For example, if you go to a movie that's described as being an animation or cartoon, animation's the more formal word for that. It just brings these characters to life. So alive or having life is what this word here is trying to convey or give you the feeling of. Now, stained glass has been made since ancient times. It's a really old art, you could say. But it was the spread of Christianity throughout Europe that saw it become a dominant art form. So it was through missionaries trying to spread Christian beliefs and teachings throughout Europe. That's when stained glass also just took on a stronger, more prominent role in life. It became a dominant art form for the people there in Europe who were Christian. Now, if you say something's dominant, it just means it's stronger or more influential than other things around it. So that's when stained glass really became popular, was during the spread of Christianity throughout Europe.
Right, dominant. We could say the dominant religion of Saudi Arabia is Islam, for example. And in this particular case, stained glass windows became the dominant art form in churches because I guess it was useful to tell people about the Bible. And with characters and settings forged into glass, these windows were used to portray religious narratives for teaching purposes. So I guess at the time people were illiterate. They couldn't really read for themselves.
There were no books, remember? There was no printing press yet.
That would make sense, yeah. And of course, there were no computers and there wasn't any radio or anything, so it wasn't easy to spread the message. But if you put these kind of pictures in stained glass, then people could look at it and they go, oh, okay, now I know the story of Jonah and the whale. There it is in stained glass.
Right. Yeah, you forget we haven't always had easy access to books, right? So before the printing press was invented, there were only, popes and priests and some monks who were sitting and copying books by using their hand and some ink. So just regular people didn't have a chance to even go to school and learn to read. So they'd hear these stories, and then they could go to church, and it was like the story was illustrated for them in the stained glass. So it must have been really effective. And it says here that the windows were used to portray religious narratives for teaching purposes. Narrative here just means a story someone is trying to communicate to you. And so it's a spoken or written account of some sort of story. So this was an effective way to teach people about Christian beliefs and things that they had, at least the Pope and the priests had learned in the Bible.
Okay, that brings us to the midway point in today's All English lecture. Let's take a break right now, but stay tuned. We'll be right back. Okay, let's continue to talk about stained glass. Again, we've got some Bible stories forged into glass, and those pictures in the windows would portray religious narratives or stories so that people could learn about them. And during the Middle Ages, some of these displays came to be known as the poor man's Bible. So yeah, there were no printing presses back then, and poor people probably couldn't read anyway. So this is how they learned about religious stories here. They would look at those displays in stained glass. Now, the printing press had yet to be developed. Had yet to means it had not happened yet. So basically, the printing press was not developed yet or had not been invented yet, and stained glass, along with paintings and carvings, gave churches a tool for spreading Christian parables. Here we've got the word parable. That's kind of like a story that tells you about a moral or something, or why you should believe in Christianity.
Yeah, it is a story, but it also has a message about morals or morality, how to make good choices, and instead of bad choices. So those are the parables that especially Jesus would tell a lot of parables in the Bible to help people understand what they should do in life, how to be better people. Now, it says radiating their stories throughout soaring churches were illuminated angels, saints, spirits, and other biblical figures. So here's some of the things that were often portrayed in these stained glass windows. Angels, saints, spirits, and then famous biblical figures. Biblical just is the adjective form for Bible. So anything associated with the Bible, you could use biblical. Radiating is a great word. It just means, really kind of shining out. It's full of energy. We often will use it to describe someone who's super duper happy, right? Oh, she's radiating joy, or she's radiating happiness. Someone whose face is just really lit up with pure happiness or joy. You can kind of feel that joy coming out of their face, coming out of their body. It's kind of a feeling of, and just a lot of energy. So these stories would radiate throughout these churches. And you'd see angels, of course, saints, people who are really holy, spirits, and of course, famous figures from the Bible. Like I mentioned, John the Baptist, who baptized Jesus. Or maybe Jonah and the whale, that's the Old Testament. Jonah was swallowed by the whale. That would have been a fun stained glass window, especially for kids.
Yeah, it would have been a lot of fun there. And by the time the 12th century rolled around, when it was the 1300s, advances in architectural capability allowed church builders to install enormous windows that filled their interiors with a more radiant kaleidoscope of color. So I guess in the 12th century, they were able to build churches much larger, and so they had these big windows, and they could have lots of stained glass there, and of course that meant that a lot of sunlight would radiate into the church. We had a more radiant kaleidoscope of color. Now, kaleidoscope here would be easier explained in Chinese, but I'll be whipped and beaten if I say what the word in Chinese is. So kaleidoscope here is kind of usually a toy, and you look inside the hole there and you spin one end of it, and all the colors and the patterns will change. That's what a kaleidoscope is. So yeah, inside the church, you'll get all sorts of colors all over the place. It'll be really cool.
So manufacturing such an array of stained glass art was an extraordinary technical accomplishment. They didn't have the technology or the machinery or the tools that we have today. So doing these huge stained glass windows was really amazing. An array of just means an impressive range or display of something. I have a great array of plants in my apartment, or you might have an impressive array of music in your life. So here we have the colored sheets of glass would first be made. Here's the process we're talking about. This was done by adding something called metal oxide powder to the glass in its molten state. If something's in a molten state, it means it's been heated up to a really high degree of heat. And if you touch that, you'd probably have to have your finger cut off. It's pretty bad. So it's liquefied or turned into liquid by heat if it's in a molten state.
Right, molten means something that is usually a solid is now a liquid, like molten rock, for example.
Yeah.
In the interior or inside of the earth, there's lots of rock that
Coming
is
out of volcanoes, that
yeah, that
lava.
would be lava.
Yeah.
That's molten rock, basically. And yes, indeed, this is kind of tricky here. You take this chemical and you add it to glass that is really hot and it's like a liquid. And unique metals produced individual colors. So you had to know your chemistry there and how much to mix with how much glass. Cobalt, that's a kind of material there. It would turn glass blue, for example. We've heard of cobalt blue. That's a common color used by artists.
Yeah, and for cars sometimes, cobalt blue. However, it says the production process was unpredictable. It didn't always react the way you thought it should, as it required a precise amount of ingredients. Like Tom said, you had to know your chemistry, and used a furnace that was difficult to control. Our lives are so much easier today. A furnace, back then for them, was a structure in which they heated things, usually using wood or coal, and they'd get it as hot as they could. But you couldn't just, take a temperature dial, and turn it a little hotter, a little cooler. That didn't exist back then. You had to get the fire just perfect to get the heat level or degree of heat right.
Exactly. So, yeah, it was very technical and it required a lot of skill. And here it says the production process was unpredictable, as you said, because you needed just the right amount of ingredients and you needed the exact temperature.
Yeah.
And again, if you have these variations, you'd have imperfections. You wouldn't get cobalt blue. Maybe you'd get neon blue or something like that. And you'd think, that doesn't look good. We got to start all over.
Or sky blue.
Exactly. There are different hues of green and blue and red and stuff like that. And glass of different colors would then be cut into precise shapes to fit together in the patterns that artisans had previously sketched out. So yeah, first of all, you make a sketch, probably using pencils and colored pencils and stuff like that, and then you start working on the glass, and then you got to cut them into exact, precise shapes, and then you're going to fit them together. Now, if you're working with this stuff, you are an artisan. You're not an artist. That's someone who works on an easel making a painting or something, but artisans usually are people who use their hands and put things together like arts and crafts or things like that. So.
It can also be food, Tom. Nowadays we have bread artisans and cheese artisans. So they specialize in these areas, but they're so skilled that they get to call themselves artisans. Yeah.
Exactly. So, yeah, they're highly skilled people here. They've had years of training. And so they made these sketches and then they cut the pieces of glass into exact, precise shapes. And then they would fit them together. But how do you get those pieces of glass to stay together? Well, they would be rigorously welded together with lead and a hot piece of iron. So, yeah, you'd use lead there, which, of course, is a very heavy metal. And they would be welded together. If you weld something, you use heat to make two things stick together. You get people welding metal together all the time to make cars and bicycles and stuff like that. And in this particular case, they would be welded rigorously. So if something's rigorous, as the adjective here, it means you're doing a lot of work, you're working really hard to do it, and you're working for a long time.
I would say that most of the guys and women who train in the army or the military, they go through rigorous training or they're rigorously trained. What they have to do in training is quite difficult. Moving down to the final paragraph, it says the ways in which art, science, religion, and technical skill were fused to create such aesthetic wonders remarkable. Truly, it's pretty much a miracle based on what we know about the scientific information they had already and the things that they had to use. Their tools were very primitive, you could say, compared to what we have today. So what they did was really create little pieces of miracles. I think a lot of the buildings back then were quite miraculous, especially when you compare what our buildings look like today. They seem much more simple today than they used to build back then. I don't know how they did it. Now, when you say something or some things are fused together, here we're using it as a verb. It just means they're joined together or they're blended together to form one single thing. So we're saying that these different techniques and skills and knowledge, these were all blended or fused together, and what they created was an aesthetic wonder. Aesthetic here is a word you'll see when you're studying more about art and history, things like that. Aesthetic just means things that are concerned with beauty or even the appreciation of beauty. You'll often hear, oh, I really like that architect's aesthetic, or I like that designer's aesthetic. Just kind of their style. That's a way you can kind of translate it in your mind.
Yeah, you could use this word to describe buildings, for example. The building is very practical and very functional, and it's also aesthetically pleasing.
Right.
It looks pretty cool. It's an effective building, and it's beautiful at the same time. That's, of course, what architects probably strive for. A building that's useful and beautiful at the same time. It's aesthetically pleasing. And yes, indeed, you fused all those things together. You mix them all together. You fuse them together, art, science, religion, skill, etc., to make truly a wonderful work of art. And although stained glass is still made today, never does it seem to be produced on such a majestic scale.
True.
So here we've got this phrase, never does it seem. I could also say, it never seems to be produced on such a majestic scale. Yeah, they make it today still, but if you really want to see something wonderful in terms of stained glass, you got to look to the past. Some of those churches in Europe certainly have some wonderful displays of stained glass. People nowadays don't really make things so big anymore.
I did want to mention that phrase, never does it seem, will really be found in written articles more than it will be in spoken English. Tom just gave you a translation of that. It doesn't seem is what we'd say. Just, I was just going to say Chinese right there. It's what we speak typically, but if you're writing, it sounds more elegant if you use that phrase, never does it seem. And majestic just means really impressive beauty or dignity associated with something as wonderful as, a king or an emperor or heaven. So if you get a chance to see some of these just amazing stained glass windows, I hope you take the chance and go.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our lesson for today, and it brings us to the end of this month's All English lecture. Hopefully you did okay without relying on the crutch of the Chinese teacher. Okay, so thanks for joining us, and please join us again next time for another edition of our program. From all of us here at English Digest, I'm Tom.
I'm Stephanie.
Goodbye.
Bye.